There is a 45-second sequence in Better Call Saul, where Jimmy McGill sits alone in a copy room, running the same document through a photocopier over and over, and the camera just watches him do it. No music, no dialogue, no dramatic revelation. Just a man and a machine, and the specific sound of paper moving through rollers in an empty room. Most people who watched that scene did not realize they were watching one of the finest pieces of character work in the history of American television. Better Call Saul has that problem constantly. It does its best work so quietly that the people watching do not always recognize what they are seeing until it is over. And for years, that quietness got the show dismissed as the lesser version of the thing it came from. A worthy spin-off, a solid prequel, a good show standing in the shadow of a great one. That reading is wrong, and today we are going to prove it, section by section, scene by scene, character by character. Section 1. The superiority of inevitability. How BCS weaponizes what you already know. Here is the thing about surprises. They work once. You watch a magician pull a rabbit out of a hat and your jaw drops. You watch him do it again and you start looking for the hidden pocket. The trick hasn't changed. You have. And once you've seen it, no version of that same trick will ever hit you the same way again. Breaking Bad built its entire emotional engine on surprise. Walter White was a high school chemistry teacher. He had cancer. He started cooking meth. And then, step by step, episode by episode, he became someone unrecognizable. A monster wearing the face of a man you used to feel sorry for. The show worked because nobody saw it coming. Not the audience, not the critics, not even the writers in the early seasons who were genuinely figuring it out as they went. Walter's transformation from someone you pitied into someone you feared was the engine driving everything. Every season escalated the shock. Every finale pushed him further past the line you thought he wouldn't cross. And it worked. It really, truly worked. Breaking Bad is one of the greatest television shows ever made, and a massive reason for that is how completely it blindsided its audience, over and over again. But here is the problem with a story built on surprise. Once you know the ending, the whole thing softens. Rewatch Breaking Bad knowing Walter dies in that lab, knowing Hank gets shot in the desert, knowing Jesse ends up in that cage, and the show is still excellent. But it is a different experience. The tension has leaked out. The surprise is gone. What made it great was in part the fact that you didn't see it coming, and you can never not see it coming again. Better Call Saul didn't have that option. It couldn't. Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould announced exactly what kind of show they were making before a single frame was filmed. Jimmy McGill becomes Saul Goodman. We already knew that. The audience had already met Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad. They'd watched him for years. He was a fast-talking, morally flexible, completely compromised criminal lawyer who helped a drug kingpin evade the law. There was no mystery about the destination. Everyone watching the very first episode of Better Call Saul already knew where Jimmy was going. That should have been a disaster. It wasn't. It became the show's greatest weapon, and the reason Better Call Saul, for all the ways it got compared unfavorably to its parent show in its early seasons, ended up doing something Breaking Bad never could. When you already know where a story ends, something changes in how you watch it. You stop waiting to be surprised. You start paying attention to something different, the why and the how, and the what it costs. Every small choice Jimmy makes carries extra weight because you can see the shadow of where that choice is pointing. A moment that might look minor, Jimmy taking a case he shouldn't, Jimmy cutting a corner, Jimmy letting himself enjoy something he knows is wrong, lands differently when you understand that this particular moment is one more brick in a wall that eventually becomes Saul Goodman. This is called dramatic irony, but let's put it in simpler terms. It's the feeling you get when you're watching someone walk towards something terrible and you can't warn them. It's the tension of knowing what they don't. Better Call Saul runs on that feeling for 6 full seasons, and it never once lets you forget that the clock is ticking. The show actually doubles this effect in a way that's genuinely clever. Every single season opens with a black and white sequence showing us Jimmy McGill after the events of Breaking Bad, living in Omaha, Nebraska under the name Gene Takovic, working at a Cinnabon. He's hiding. He's gray. He's smaller than he used to be. He makes sandwiches and tries not to be noticed, and lives in constant terror that someone will recognize him. Those Gene sequences are cold and quiet and a little depressing to watch. And they function as a reminder before every season of colorful Albuquerque story that we already know how this turns out. The color you're watching is a memory. The gray you saw at the beginning is the truth. Every scene of Jimmy laughing, scheming, hustling, winning a case, falling in love with Kim, all of it is happening inside a frame that already shows you the result. You can see the walls closing before Jimmy can. Breaking Bad never had this. It couldn't. The whole point of Breaking Bad was that you didn't know the walls were closing. Better Call Saul makes the closing walls the entire show. And then it does something that Breaking Bad's structure of surprise genuinely couldn't do. It makes you feel grief before the thing you're grieving has even happened yet. There is a scene in Season 1 where Jimmy gets passed over for a job at a prestigious law firm. The firm is run by his older brother, Chuck. Jimmy had earned that job. He'd worked for it. He'd done everything right, by the rules, the legitimate way. And Chuck blocked him. Not because Jimmy wasn't qualified, because Chuck didn't believe people like Jimmy deserved to be lawyers at all. In a show built on surprise, that moment lands as injustice. It's unfair. It makes you angry on Jimmy's behalf. It makes you want him to succeed. And those feelings are there in Better Call Saul, too. But underneath them is something else, something the inevitability of the show's structure adds. You know this moment is one of the moments that made Jimmy into Saul. You know this betrayal is going to cost something. You watch it happen and you feel the weight of knowing that the man on screen is going to carry this wound for years, and that it is going to slowly change him. That's not the feeling Breaking Bad gives you. Breaking Bad makes you feel shock. Better Call Saul makes you feel something closer to loss. A grief for someone who is right in front of you, still fine, still trying, still who they used to be. That is harder to do. It is rarer on television. And it is the emotional engine that Better Call Saul runs on for its entire length. There is another dimension to what the show does with foreknowledge that is worth spending some time on, because it affects not just how you feel, but how carefully you watch. Because you know the destination, the journey becomes everything. You pay attention to details you would ignore in a show built on plot twists. The way Jimmy's posture changes across seasons. The way he stops making certain jokes. The way Kim looks at him differently in Season 5 than she did in Season 1. The way Mike Ehrmantraut, who starts the show as a parking lot attendant, slowly and quietly becomes something else entirely. None of these changes are announced. None of them are accompanied by dramatic music or a big speech. They accumulate across years of careful, patient storytelling. Breaking Bad moved fast because it had to. The audience needed to see Walt change before they got comfortable with the version they were watching. Every season had to push him further, escalate faster, get bigger. That pace is exhilarating and one of Breaking Bad's great pleasures. But it also means the show doesn't have much time to breathe. It is constantly in a hurry to show you the next terrible thing Walt does. Better Call Saul is never in a hurry. It can afford not to be, because the audience already knows the big terrible thing is coming. So instead of rushing to the next escalation, it lingers. It watches characters do ordinary things at ordinary speed. It spends entire scenes, sometimes entire episodes, in the quiet spaces between major events. Mike Ehrmantraut dismantling a car piece by piece looking for a tracking device, working methodically, alone, in silence, across what feels like real time. Jimmy at the copy machine. Kim driving to work. These scenes frustrated some viewers, especially in the early seasons. Critics compared the show's pace unfavorably to Breaking Bad and called it slow. Tom Shales of The Washington Post criticized the first season for what he described as too much dialogue and scenes that stretched too long. Those criticisms were fair assessments of what the show was doing. They were just wrong about whether what it was doing was a flaw. The patience was the point. The slowness was intentional. A show that knows its audience already knows the ending doesn't need to rush them anywhere. It can make them sit with the characters long enough to actually know them, not as plot functions, but as people. And that changes everything about what the show can do emotionally when something finally breaks. When the big moments come in Better Call Saul, they hit harder than almost anything in Breaking Bad. Not because they are more dramatic on paper, but because the show has spent so much time making you care about these particular people in this particular world that the stakes feel personal. By the time Chuck McGill dies, quietly, alone, in a fire he started himself, the show has spent 3 seasons making you understand exactly who he was and why he ended up there. The moment is not a shock. It is a grief, and it hits harder than shock. Breaking Bad surprised you. Better Call Saul made you care so deeply that it didn't need to. Vince Gilligan has talked about the challenge of making a prequel work, because the structural risk is enormous. If the audience knows the destination, why take the journey? His answer, built across 6 seasons of Better Call Saul, is that the journey is the point. That knowing where something ends doesn't diminish the tragedy of watching it arrive there. It deepens it. That foreknowledge is not a weakness to be hidden, but a tool to be used. And the show proves it. Season by season, the audience watched Jimmy McGill become someone they didn't want him to become, knowing it was coming, unable to stop it, and caring more because of that helplessness, rather than less. Breaking Bad asked you to watch and be surprised. Better Call Saul asked you to watch and mourn. The second thing is harder to pull off. It is also, for a viewer willing to give it the patience it asks for, the more rewarding experience. The closing walls that Gene Takovic lives behind in those black and white opening sequences are not just a clever structural device. They are the thesis statement of the entire show. Jimmy McGill started with options. He ended with a gray Cinnabon in Omaha and a name that wasn't his. You know that from the first minutes of the first episode. And somehow, impossibly, knowing it makes every minute of the journey sadder and more real. That is what Better Call Saul does with inevitability. And it is something Breaking Bad, for all its greatness, never attempted. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes all of this land as hard as it does, the grief, the dread, the accumulated sadness of watching someone lose themselves in slow motion, is not just the structure. It is the specific person at the center of it. And the specific person at the center of Better Call Saul turns out to be one of the most carefully constructed characters in the history of American television. But she is not the one you expect. Section 2. Kim Wexler, the best character in either show. She was not supposed to matter this much. When Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould wrote the pilot episode of Better Call Saul, Kim Wexler existed as a sketch, a name, a face in a hallway. The writers themselves have admitted they had no real plan for her. Gilligan described Kim in the early going as perhaps a love interest from Jimmy's past, or a potential one in his future. Someone who might drift in and out of the story. Peter Gould said the original idea was simply to have a character who could inject some basic legal ethics into Jimmy's world. Someone to stand next to him and represent the version of lawyering that plays by the rules. That was it. That was the plan. 6 seasons later, Kim Wexler is the best character in either Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad. Not the most iconic, not the most quoted, but the best. The most fully realized, the most emotionally honest, the most carefully built human being across the entire universe that Vince Gilligan created. And the way she got there is itself one of the most remarkable stories in modern television. It started with Ray Seahorn. When Seahorn came in and began playing Kim, the writers started noticing something. The character on the page was functional. The character Seahorn was bringing to the screen was something else entirely. Kim wasn't just standing next to Jimmy and representing the straight and narrow. She was a full person. Someone with her own internal life, her own private wounds, her own way of holding herself that told you things about her that the dialogue never said out loud. Seahorn communicated entire paragraphs of feeling through silence. Through the way Kim's jaw would tighten slightly. Through the way she'd pause before answering a question she didn't like. Through the way she'd look at Jimmy when she thought he wasn't watching. The writers saw what Seahorn was doing, and they started writing toward it. They expanded Kim's role. They gave her more screen time, more story, more of her own problems separate from Jimmy's. They made her a main character in a show that was supposed to be about someone else. And then they did something that very few television shows have the confidence to do. They let her become more important than the title character. By the end of Better Call Saul, the show belongs to Kim Wexler as much as it belongs to Jimmy McGill. Some critics argued it belonged to her more. To understand why Kim is the best character in either show, you have to start with what she is not. She is not a prop. She is not a reward or a punishment for Jimmy's choices. She is not there to tell him when he's wrong and forgive him when he apologizes. She is not a supporting character who exists to make the main character more interesting. Every one of those things is a trap that television shows fall into constantly when they write women who are connected to complicated male leads. Breaking Bad fell into most of them with Skylar White, who spent years being the thing Walter had to manage rather than a character with her own full story. Kim Wexler is a completely different construction. She has a past that the show reveals slowly and deliberately. A mother who drank, who stole, who modeled a particular way of surviving the world that Kim spent her whole adult life trying not to repeat. She has a career she built entirely herself, working in the mailroom at the law firm Hamlin, and McGill, and clawing her way up to become one of their best lawyers through nothing but talent and relentless work. She has professional ambitions that have nothing to do with Jimmy. She has a moral compass that she takes seriously, that she works hard to maintain, and that she slowly, painfully compromises across 6 seasons in ways that make complete and terrible sense, given everything the show has shown you about who she is. That last part is the key to what makes Kim remarkable. She breaks bad. Not the way Jimmy breaks bad. Not through a slow erosion of resistance. Not because life kept pushing her in a direction she weakly failed to resist. Kim breaks bad by choice. She chooses it with her eyes open. And the show makes that choice feel completely, devastatingly believable. Here is how it happens. Kim starts the show as someone who follows the rules. Not because she is naive. She is one of the sharpest people in any room she enters. But because she genuinely believes in what the rules are supposed to protect. She does pro bono legal work, meaning she takes cases for people who can't pay her, out of her own time and her own pocket, because she thinks poor people deserve good legal representation, and she can provide it. That belief is real. It is the most Kim thing about her for most of the show. But Kim also loves Jimmy. And loving Jimmy means being around someone who treats rules as obstacles rather than protections. Someone who finds the gray areas and lives in them and makes it look like fun. Someone who, when he breaks a rule, doesn't feel shame. He feels alive. Kim watches that, and something happens. Not right away. Not in a single moment. Across seasons, very slowly, she starts to notice that the rule-following she's devoted herself to hasn't always produced the outcomes she was promised. Good people get bad deals in the courtroom. Poor people get away with things that less powerful people get punished for. The system she respects keeps failing the clients she's trying to protect. And then she looks at Jimmy, who bends the system when the system is failing. And sometimes it works. Sometimes the bend helps someone. Sometimes the rules deserved to be bent. That crack in her thinking is where everything begins. The show builds this so gradually that you almost don't notice it happening. Kim helps Jimmy with a small con in season 2. She enjoys it. Not in a guilty way, in a genuinely delighted way. The way someone enjoys a thing they didn't know they were allowed to want. She tucks that enjoyment away and tells herself it was a one-time thing. Then it happens again. Then she suggests the next one herself. Then she starts designing them. By season 5, Kim Wexler, the woman who spent years trying not to become her mother, the lawyer who took on cases for free because she believed in justice, the most morally serious person in the show, is orchestrating a long con against Howard Hamlin, a fundamentally decent man, because she decided he deserved it. The plan is meticulous and cold, and motivated not just by a sense that Howard is imperfect, but by the fact that Kim finds this kind of thing exciting, in a way that filing legal paperwork never was. She tells Jimmy this herself, in one of the most uncomfortable moments in the show. She admits that she was having too much fun. Not that she was manipulated into it, not that she regretted it as it was happening, that she enjoyed it, and that her enjoyment of it is the real problem. That admission is what separates Kim Wexler from almost every other character in either show. She is not a victim of her circumstances. She is not someone who was ground down by an unfair world until she had no choice. She is someone who found a dark thing inside herself and, for a while, let herself have it. The show treats that with complete seriousness and complete honesty. Then Howard Hamlin dies. He gets killed in Kim and Jimmy's apartment, the direct consequence of a situation their scheming helped create. And Kim watches it happen. And everything changes. She leaves. She leaves Albuquerque. She leaves the law. She leaves Jimmy. and she goes to Florida and becomes the smallest possible version of herself, answering phones at a sprinkler company, living alone, cut off from everything. Not because she got caught, not because anyone forced her out, because she cannot live with what she helped cause. The guilt is not performed, it is not dramatic. It is just there, quietly destroying the life she spent decades building. Because Kim Wexler takes her moral accounting seriously, even when the only person doing the accounting is herself. This is where she becomes the most extraordinary character in either show. Walter White never genuinely reckoned with what he did. He constructed elaborate justifications. He convinced himself he was doing it for his family, then convinced himself that was always a lie, and he just liked it. At the very end, in one of Breaking Bad's finest moments, he told Skyler the truth, that he did it for himself, because it made him feel alive. That admission is powerful, but it came at the very end, when Walt was already dying and had nothing left to protect. It cost him nothing. There was no way for him to act on it. Kim's reckoning happens while she still has a life to live, and she acts on it. In the final season of Better Call Saul, Kim goes back to Albuquerque. She sits in front of Howard Hamlin's widow and tells her everything. What she and Jimmy did, how they planned it, what it led to. The confession serves no legal purpose. She is not compelled to make it. It will not bring Howard back. It will not make Kim's guilt go away. She makes it because it is the right thing to do, and because she is still, underneath everything that happened, someone who believes that the right thing has to be done. Then she goes to the authorities and gives a statement that could be used against Jimmy in court. She does this voluntarily, knowing what it will mean for him, because she is still Kim Wexler, even after everything. Ray Seahorn plays the bus scene, Kim breaking down silently on an airport shuttle after giving her confession, without a single word of dialogue. It is just her face and what's on it, and what it costs her to hold herself together and fail to do it. Brian Tallarico of Rolling Stone called Seahorn's body of work on this show one of the best performances on any show in the last decade. Several critics called her repeated exclusion from Emmy wins one of the most unjust oversights in awards history. She was nominated multiple times and never won. The awards conversation around her absence tells you something about how seriously the industry eventually took what she was doing on screen. What makes Kim the best character in either show is not any single moment or scene. It is the totality of her arc. She starts as someone trying to be good in a world that makes that difficult. She finds out she has a capacity for darkness she didn't know about. She lets herself explore that capacity, fully aware of what she's doing. She pays for it in a currency that can never be refunded. The career she built, the man she loved, the version of herself she was most proud of. And then she tries, in whatever incomplete way is still available to her, to do right by the people she hurt. That is a full human life, compressed into 6 seasons of television. It is not the life of a supporting character. It is not the arc of someone who exists to make the main character more interesting. It is the story of a person, complete and specific and heartbreaking, who happened to be standing next to the person whose name is in the title. Breaking Bad had Jesse Pinkman, who is a genuinely great character. One of the most emotionally honest portrayals of someone being destroyed by circumstance and used by someone more powerful than him. Jesse is real, and he matters, and his story is devastating. But Jesse's story is largely about what Walter White does to him. His arc is defined by Walt's. He exists, in significant part, as Walter's conscience. The thing Walt feels but refuses to feel. Kim Wexler exists entirely on her own terms. Her arc is not defined by Jimmy's. Her choices are her own. Her darkness is her own. Her redemption is her own. She does not exist to be Jimmy's conscience. She has her own conscience, and her own struggle with it, and her own private reckoning that happens whether or not Jimmy is in the room. That independence, that completeness, is what Walter White's world never quite gave its female characters. Kim Wexler got it. And Ray Seahorn made sure that the writer's trust in her was repaid in full. Every single episode, across 6 seasons, in one of the most quietly extraordinary performances in the history of the medium. She was not supposed to matter this much. She matters more than anyone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And she is not the only one. Because while Kim Wexler is the best character in either show, Better Call Saul also produced the best villain. Not the most frightening, not the most powerful. The best, the most painful, the most honest, the most impossibly human monster in the entire Albuquerque universe. His name is Chuck McGill, and he is Jimmy's brother. And what the show does with him is something Breaking Bad never attempted. Section 3. Chuck McGill is a better antagonist than anyone in Breaking Bad. Gus Fring will kill you and then go open his restaurant for the lunch rush. That is terrifying. Giancarlo Esposito plays Gus with such complete, still control that even a scene where he is just pouring someone a glass of water feels dangerous. The Salamanca cousins move through scenes like they are already deciding where to bury you. Tuco Salamanca is a live wire with no off switch. Breaking Bad built some of the most compelling villains in television history, and the case for any one of them being the best antagonist in the Albuquerque universe is not a weak case. But none of them are Chuck McGill. Chuck McGill is Jimmy's older brother. He is a founding partner at the law firm Hamlin, and McGill. He graduated magna cum laude from Georgetown University Law Center, one of the most respected law schools in the country. He clerked for federal courts before building his career in Albuquerque. By every external measure, Chuck McGill is a success. A brilliant, respected, accomplished man at the top of his profession. He is also the most devastating villain in either show. And what makes him devastating is not what he does to Jimmy's body or Jimmy's freedom. It is what he does to Jimmy's belief in himself. When Better Call Saul begins, Chuck is living as a recluse. He has developed what he believes is a severe sensitivity to electricity. He cannot be near phones, cannot have the lights on, wraps himself in a foil blanket when he has to go outside. His law partner, Howard Hamlin, has been quietly managing the firm and covering for Chuck's condition. Jimmy, despite everything complicated between them, has been coming over to Chuck's dark, electricity-free house regularly to bring him groceries, check on him, and take care of him. Jimmy does this faithfully, without being asked, because Chuck is his brother and Jimmy loves him. That detail matters enormously. It is the foundation of everything the show does with their relationship. Jimmy is not naive about Chuck. He knows his brother is difficult. He knows Chuck has always looked down on him. But Jimmy believes, genuinely and completely, that underneath all of it, Chuck loves him back. That is why he keeps showing up with groceries. That is why, when Chuck got sick and stopped coming into work, Jimmy didn't abandon him. He stayed. Chuck does not love Jimmy back. Not in any way that functions like love. The show reveals this slowly, the way a curtain gets pulled back inch by inch. In Season 1, Chuck seems to be helping Jimmy. He seems to want good things for his younger brother. He seems proud, in his reserved way, of the work Jimmy is doing as a public defender. The audience wants to believe in the relationship because Jimmy believes in it so completely. And watching someone love another person that openly makes you root for the love to be real. Then comes the episode called Pimento, at the end of season 1. Jimmy has put together a major case, a class action lawsuit on behalf of elderly residents who were being cheated. It is genuinely impressive legal work, the kind of work that could change his career. He brings it to Chuck, expecting his brother to help shepherd it through their firm. And Chuck, quietly, deliberately, efficiently, kills it. He has been working behind the scenes to make sure Jimmy never gets credit for the case, never gets hired by the firm, never gets the professional recognition the work deserves. Jimmy finds out. He confronts Chuck. And Chuck tells him the truth, directly and without apology. He says he has always known that Jimmy is not a real lawyer, that Jimmy will always be what he was growing up, a con artist called Slippin' Jimmy, someone who bends rules and cuts corners and slides through life on charm instead of earning things honestly. He says he blocked Jimmy from the firm because he does not believe Jimmy belongs in the legal profession. Not because of a single mistake, because of who Chuck fundamentally believes Jimmy is. Then he says something that lands like a punch. He tells Jimmy that he did it to protect the clients, to protect the law, to protect the things that actually matter. He frames his own cruelty as a moral responsibility. That scene is one of the best scenes in either show. Bob Odenkirk and Michael McKean, face to face, the weight of a lifetime between them. And the audience, watching someone they love, get told by the person whose approval they most wanted that they were never going to get it. Not because Jimmy failed, because Chuck decided years ago that Jimmy was not capable of succeeding legitimately, and built his entire relationship with his brother around that verdict. Here is what makes Chuck a better villain than Gus Fring or anyone else in Breaking Bad. Gus wants to kill Walter White. The cousins want to kill people. Tuco is violent and unpredictable. All of their threats are external. You can see them coming. You can prepare for them, run from them, fight back against them. They are dangers in the world. Chuck's threat is internal. He lives inside Jimmy's head. His verdict on Jimmy, that Jimmy is and always will be a con artist who does not deserve the things he has worked for, is a verdict that Jimmy has to fight against every single day. And the terrible, twisting thing the show does is that Chuck is not entirely wrong. Jimmy did grow up as Slippin' Jimmy. He did run cons. He did cut corners. He did use charm in places where other people used hard work. Chuck saw that, assessed it, and formed a conclusion that had enough truth in it to be impossible to simply dismiss. But Chuck's conclusion missed something crucial. Jimmy also changed. He went to law school through a correspondence program, the kind of program that other lawyers look down on, and he passed the bar. He took a job as a public defender, making almost no money because he believed in the work. He put together a legitimate, serious, well-researched legal case entirely on his own. He became, genuinely and through real effort, a real lawyer. Chuck couldn't see that, wouldn't see it, because if Jimmy was capable of becoming something legitimate, then Chuck's entire justification for blocking him, dismissing him, and managing him all those years fell apart. Chuck needed Jimmy to be Slippin' Jimmy forever. It protected something in Chuck that he could not afford to have disturbed. Michael McKean talked about what sat at the center of his character's resentment. He described it simply. He said the specific pain was this: Chuck made their mother proud. but Jimmy made their mother laugh. That one sentence contains the entire show. Chuck was the successful one, the scholar, the achiever. He did everything right, followed every rule, earned every credential. And his mother was proud of him, the way you are proud of a thing that works correctly. But when Jimmy walked into a room, their mother lit up in a different way. The way you light up for someone who surprises you and delights you and makes the room feel more alive. Chuck could not earn that. He could not study for it, or work for it, or achieve it. It was just something Jimmy had, naturally, without effort. Chuck spent his whole life achieving things that earned him respect. What he wanted was what Jimmy had without trying. And he could never forgive his brother for that. This is a type of villain that Breaking Bad never produced. Breaking Bad's antagonists were motivated by power, money, territory, or survival. Their cruelty had clear external logic. Chuck's cruelty is motivated by something much smaller and much more human. Jealousy dressed up as principle. He convinced himself that his campaign against Jimmy was about protecting the law and protecting clients and protecting the integrity of the legal profession. The show lets you see through that. Chuck is protecting himself, his feelings, his sense of superiority over the one person who always made him feel lesser just by existing.
The episode called Chicanery in Season 3 puts them in a courtroom together for a bar hearing. Chuck trying to get Jimmy disbarred, Jimmy and Kim fighting back. It is one of the most gripping courtroom scenes in television history. By the end of it, Chuck has exposed himself. Jimmy has planted a cell phone battery on Chuck's person to demonstrate that Chuck's sensitivity to electricity is psychological rather than physical. When Chuck realizes what has happened and loses control on the stand, his condition and his pride crumbling simultaneously in front of a room full of colleagues, it should feel like a victory. Jimmy has won. The audience has been rooting for Jimmy. Instead, it feels like tragedy. Chuck on that stand, unraveling, is not a villain being defeated. He is a man being destroyed. And the show makes you feel that, because it spent 2.5 seasons making sure you understood exactly who Chuck was and why he ended up there. Chuck dies in the Season 3 finale in an episode called Lantern. His malpractice insurance has been canceled, something Jimmy had a hand in bringing about. His firm has bought him out. His career is over. Alone in his dark house, his psychosomatic illness back at full force, he begins methodically knocking things off surfaces. A gas lantern falls. The fire starts. Chuck knows it is starting. He does not run. It is not a dramatic death. There is no confrontation, no speech, no final moment of clarity. It is a quiet, private destruction. And it is the most emotionally costly moment in either show. Not because Chuck was a good person, but because the show made you understand him completely. His jealousy, his pride, his genuine but badly applied belief in the law, his inability to love his brother in any way that Jimmy could feel. All of it ends in a dark house with a gas lantern on the floor. Jimmy finds out about Chuck's death at the end of that episode. His reaction, or rather his deliberate decision not to react, is where you see clearly for the first time what Chuck's presence in his life had been doing to him all along. The grief Jimmy refuses to feel is the grief of someone whose entire reason for trying, whose entire audience for every achievement, is gone. Chuck was the person Jimmy most wanted to impress. Losing that possibility is not relief. It is a particular kind of emptiness that has no name. That loss, quiet, complicated, impossible to simply mourn, is the moment Jimmy McGill begins, in earnest, to become Saul Goodman. Chuck was not just the villain of Jimmy's story. He was the weight that kept Jimmy tethered.
Without that weight, Jimmy floats away into someone else entirely. Breaking Bad never gave its villain that kind of load-bearing role in the hero's soul. Gus Fring was a threat to Walter's life. Chuck McGill was the wound at the center of Jimmy's. The better villain is the one who lives inside you. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while Chuck McGill represents the sharpest emotional weapon in Better Call Saul's story, he is only part of what the show built that Breaking Bad never quite managed. Because what BCS also created, frame by frame over 6 seasons, is a visual world so carefully constructed that the camera itself becomes a storyteller. What the show does with images, with light, with the way it points its lens at the New Mexico desert, puts it in a category that very few television shows have ever reached. Section 4. The cinematography is a different art form. Most television looks like television. That is not an insult. It is just a description of how the medium works. Television is made fast, on schedules that would make most film directors laugh nervously, with episodes that need to be delivered on time every week or every season, regardless of whether the conditions were right, or the light was good, or the location cooperated. The result is that most television, even excellent television, has a visual sameness to it. It looks competent. It looks professional. It looks like what it is, a story being told efficiently, by people who are very good at working quickly. Breaking Bad broke that pattern. Vince Gilligan and his team shot the show on actual film, not digital, and they used the New Mexico landscape with a confidence and a boldness that was genuinely unusual for television at the time. The show had a visual identity, time-lapse sequences, unusual camera angles, a color palette that got darker and more saturated as Walter White's world got darker and more corrupt. Breaking Bad looked different from other television, and that difference was intentional and meaningful. Better Call Saul looked at what Breaking Bad did visually and went further. Not louder, not bigger, not more dramatic. Further, deeper, more patient and more precise, and more willing to let an image do the work that most shows would hand to dialogue. The people who built the visual language of Better Call Saul started with a specific reference point. Before filming began, Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould sat down with their camera team and watched a film called The Conformist, made in 1970 by an Italian director named Bernardo Bertolucci. The Conformist is famous among people who study film for its use of light and shadow. The way scenes are lit so that some parts of the frame are bright and other parts are in near total darkness, creating images that feel morally weighted even before the story tells you who to trust. That approach, along with influences from classic film noir and old Western movies, became the foundation for how Better Call Saul would look. Arthur Albert shot the first 2 seasons. Marshall Adams came in for seasons 3 through 6 and took the visual approach even further. Adams has described the creative environment on Better Call Saul as unlike anything he had experienced in his career. Before a single frame of season 3 was shot, Gilligan and Gould sat down with him and told him something that no television producers had ever told him before. They said they would rather reshoot a scene than have him play it safe. They told him to take risks, try things, go further than he thought he should. A reshoot was preferable to a cautious choice. Adams said he had never heard that from producers in his entire career. That permission changed what the show looked like. It meant that when Adams had an idea for a shot that felt risky, an unusual angle, a long stretch of silence with no camera movement, a composition that put the main character in the far corner of the frame instead of the center, he could try it. And the results accumulated across 4 seasons into a visual style that critics and camera professionals consistently described as the finest on television. The show mixes extreme close-ups with extreme wide shots in a way that few television productions attempt. One moment, the camera is so close to a coffee mug that you can see the wear on the ceramic. The next moment, it pulls back so far that the characters are tiny figures in the middle of the New Mexico desert, dwarfed by sky and sand and distance. The contrast between those two scales is not accidental. It is the show communicating something about the character's situation. Sometimes, they are the whole world. Sometimes the world is enormous, and they are almost nothing in it. The lighting in Better Call Saul does something that the term motivated lighting describes. It uses natural-looking light sources to tell you things about the characters without saying them. There is a shot in the early seasons of Chuck McGill in his house, lit by the window behind him. The light falls on Chuck and leaves Howard Hamlin standing nearby in shadow. Nothing in the dialogue tells you that Chuck is the one driving the scene, that Chuck is the one with the power, that Howard is operating in Chuck's darkness. The image tells you. If you covered the sound and watched the light, you would know who was in control of that room. That kind of image making is not common on television. It is what careful, patient filmmakers do when they have the time and the freedom to be deliberate. Better Call Saul gave its camera team that time and that freedom, and the results show in every frame. The desert sequences deserve their own discussion because they represent some of the most visually ambitious television ever made. New Mexico's landscape, the flat plains, the red rock formations, the enormous sky, the heat that sits on everything like a physical weight, is used in Better Call Saul not as a backdrop, but as a participant in the story. The desert in this show is not where characters travel between important scenes. The desert is where the show puts its characters when it wants to strip everything away from them and show you what they are made of when there is nothing left to hide behind. The way the camera treats that landscape is extraordinary. Wide shots place characters so small in the frame that the eye has to search for them. The horizon line sits high or low in ways that make the land feel like it is pressing down or opening up, depending on what the scene requires. Shadows fall long and hard in the afternoon light, and the show uses those shadows constantly. Characters moving in and out of light in ways that externalize internal changes without a single word. Adams has talked about the goal of making the desert feel like an active force in the story, rather than a pretty location. The camera team worked early mornings and late afternoons to capture the specific quality of desert light that the show wanted. The golden hour light that makes everything look both beautiful and harsh. A combination that matches the show's emotional register almost perfectly. Beautiful things happening in a harsh world. People trying to be good in a place that makes goodness difficult. The montages in Better Call Saul represent some of the most inventive editing and visual storytelling in either show. There is a sequence in Season 4 called Something Stupid that shows Jimmy and Kim's relationship slowly deteriorating, while they continue to live in the same apartment, work toward the same goals, and appear from the outside to be closer than ever. The sequence does this by presenting their daily lives in a split screen, Jimmy on one side, Kim on the other, moving through weeks and months in parallel, their routines visually rhyming, but never quite touching. The image of two people sharing a bathroom, sharing a bed, sharing a life, divided down the middle of the frame by a line that never goes away, communicates something about their relationship that pages of dialogue could not have done as cleanly. That kind of visual thinking requires a production that treats the camera as a storytelling tool rather than a recording device. Most television treats the camera as a recording device. It points at the actors and captures what they do and makes sure you can see everyone's face clearly. Better Call Saul points the camera at the actors and asks what the image can say that the actors cannot. The episode called Bagman, which gets its own full discussion later in this essay, was shot on location in the desert 2 hours away from where the show normally filmed. It took 18 days to complete. The average episode takes 9. The camera work in that episode has been compared directly to Lawrence of Arabia, a film from 1962 that is considered one of the most beautifully shot movies ever made. That comparison is not casual praise. Lawrence of Arabia is taught in film schools. Its camera work is studied. Placing a television episode in that conversation is a serious claim. And the people making it were serious critics who had seen both. Marshall Adams used a long lens for the desert sequences in Bagman, which has a specific effect. It compresses the distance between the characters and the horizon, making the landscape feel like it is closing in, like there is nowhere to go and the desert itself is the walls of a prison. That effect reinforced exactly what the story was doing, where two men are trapped in open space with no vehicle, almost no water, and a pile of money that is going to get them killed if they cannot figure out how to move it. The black and white sequences that open every season, the Gene Takovic storyline set in Omaha after the events of Breaking Bad, use the absence of color in a way that is not simply stylistic. Black and white in Better Call Saul means consequence. It means the time after all the choices have been made and all the damage has been done. The color sequences are the cause. The black and white is the effect. Every time the show returns to Gene, it returns to a world drained of the warmth and life that the color sequences contain. And the visual shift communicates a kind of emotional deflation that is impossible to put into words, but completely clear to anyone watching. Breaking Bad was shot on film, which gives it a texture and a grain that digital cameras do not naturally produce. It is a beautiful-looking show. Better Call Saul is shot on digital cameras, but was deliberately given a visual approach that honors the film tradition. The lighting, the compositions, the patience with which the camera holds on images, in ways that make the digital format feel warmer and more textured than digital television usually does. When the Breaking Bad scenes appear inside Better Call Saul, the show actually switched back to film cameras to capture that specific texture, a detail so careful and deliberate that it tells you everything about how seriously the visual team took their responsibilities. When Vince Gilligan directed one episode of Better Call Saul in Season 5, he had the Breaking Bad scenes shot on film specifically so they would feel different from the rest of the show. He described watching that footage come back and feeling emotional, not just because he was seeing Saul Goodman's office again, but because it was captured on film, and that made him feel the connection to the original show in a physical, tangible way that digital could not have provided. That level of care, a director feeling emotional about what medium his scene was captured on because it meant something, is the level at which Better Call Saul operated visually for its entire run. Most television shows tell you what is happening. Better Call Saul shows you what it means. The difference between those two things is the difference between a camera that records and a camera that thinks. Better Call Saul had a camera that thought, and it thought carefully, deliberately, and at a level that has rarely been matched on television before or since. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All of that visual craft, the patience, the precision, the willingness to let an image carry the weight, built toward one episode that proved definitively what Better Call Saul was capable of when everything came together at once. An episode so ambitious, so carefully made, and so completely realized that it ended years of debate about whether this show could stand alongside the very best moments of its predecessor. Section 5. Bagman is the best single episode in either show. For years, the conversation had a settled answer. If you asked anyone who had watched both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul which single episode represented the peak of what Vince Gilligan's universe was capable of, they would say Ozymandias. Season 5, Episode 14 of Breaking Bad, directed by Rian Johnson. The episode where Hank Schrader gets shot in the desert, where Walt's entire constructed world collapses in a single hour. Where Bryan Cranston delivers what many called the greatest single performance in television history. Ozymandias has a 10 out of 10 rating on every major review site. It is consistently placed on lists of the greatest individual episodes ever made, not just in Breaking Bad, not just in prestige television, but in the entire history of the medium. The case for Ozymandias being the best episode in either show was so strong and held for so long that it quietly became one of the arguments people used against Better Call Saul. Breaking Bad had Ozymandias. What did Better Call Saul have to match it? Season 5, Episode 8. Bagman. Bagman did not sneak up on anyone who was paying close attention to what Better Call Saul had been building. But when it aired, it settled the conversation. Not by imitating what Ozymandias did, by doing something completely different and doing it at the same level of craft, commitment, and emotional precision. One critic noted that Better Call Saul had finally delivered an episode to rival Breaking Bad's best, and that it accomplished this remarkable achievement without having to imitate its parent show at all. Here is what happens in Bagman. Lalo Salamanca is in jail, awaiting trial. His bail has been set at $7 million in cash. Lalo needs someone to go pick up that money from a remote location in the desert near the Mexican border and bring it back. He asks Jimmy McGill to do it. Jimmy, who is now operating as Saul Goodman and is Lalo's lawyer, agrees. He tells Kim it will be easy. No one will suspect a lawyer of being a money courier. He negotiates an extra $100,000 for himself on top of the arrangement. Kim begs him not to go. She tells him he is a lawyer, not a bagman for drug dealers. Jimmy goes anyway. He picks up the money, 2 large bags containing $7 million in cash, from Lalo's cousins, the Salamanca twins, at the remote desert location. He starts driving back. And then several vehicles cut him off on the road. Armed men get out. They take the money and prepare to kill Jimmy. Then Mike Ehrmantraut, who has been following Jimmy from a distance on behalf of Gus Fring, opens fire from a hillside position and kills almost all of the gunmen. One survives and escapes in the only vehicle that still runs. Every other vehicle, including Jimmy's, is destroyed in the firefight. Jimmy and Mike are now alone in the desert. 2 large bags of money between them. No vehicle, almost no water. The surviving gunman is still out there, somewhere, and will eventually come back. The nearest road is miles away. The temperature is extreme, and they cannot call for help because using a phone would give away their position. That setup, 2 men, a desert, impossible odds, almost no dialogue, is what Bagman spends the rest of its running time inside. And the way it handles that situation is what makes it the best single episode in either show. Vince Gilligan directed Bagman himself. He had returned to direct 1 episode of Season 5 after finishing work on El Camino, the Breaking Bad film. And he and Peter Gould chose this episode for him specifically because of what it demanded. Gilligan later described it as probably the most challenging thing he had ever directed in his career. He said the shootout sequence alone took multiple days to film. The entire episode took 18 days to complete, compared to the 9 days a standard episode required. The production shot on location at a real desert site called the Tohajili Navajo chapter, 2 hours from where the show normally filmed in Albuquerque. The episode received a perfect 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with an average score of 9.83 out of 10 from 13 reviews. But the numbers tell you less than the specific choices do. Gilligan wanted the desert sequences to feel like a particular kind of movie. He specifically referenced Lawrence of Arabia, the 1962 film famous for its vast desert images that make human beings look impossibly small against the landscape. He and Marshall Adams used a long lens to achieve that effect, a type of camera lens that compresses distance and makes the horizon feel closer, pressing in on the characters, removing the sense of openness that most desert footage has. The result is a desert that feels like a trap, wide open and inescapable simultaneously. The episode is largely silent. Jimmy and Mike walk. They conserve water. They argue about whether to keep moving or stay still. Mike, who has been doing this kind of work for years, is methodical and emotionless about their situation. Jimmy, who has never been anywhere near this kind of physical danger in his life, is falling apart. He is sunburned and dehydrated and genuinely terrified. At one point, he has to drink his own urine to survive. That detail, a lawyer in a nice suit drinking his own urine in the New Mexico desert, is not played for comedy. It is played with complete seriousness, as the specific humiliation that it is, and what it communicates is that Jimmy McGill has crossed a line he cannot uncross. He is not adjacent to the cartel anymore. He is in it. He is in a desert drinking his own urine because he made a choice that he cannot undo. And the show does not let him or the audience forget for a single moment what that choice cost. The conversation between Jimmy and Mike in that desert contains what is probably the most important Mike Ehrmantraut speech in either show. Jimmy, exhausted and close to giving up, asks Mike how he keeps going, how he keeps moving in a situation like this, how he finds the will to put one foot in front of the other when everything is terrible and there is no good outcome in sight. Mike stops walking. He turns to Jimmy, and he explains, simply and without drama, what he is doing all of this for. He says he has people waiting for him. They do not know what he does, and they never will, because not knowing keeps them safe. He does what he does so they can have a better life. He says that whether he lives or dies does not really matter to him, as long as they have what they need. And then he says that when it is his time to go, he will go, knowing he did everything he could for them. Then he asks Jimmy how he keeps going. And Jimmy, after a pause, says he should have been home hours ago, that Kim is going to be worried sick. That exchange does more work in 2 minutes than most television episodes do in an hour. It tells you everything about both men. Mike is a person who has made a complete peace with what he does and why he does it, who has found a way to hollow out his own survival instinct and replace it with purpose on behalf of others. He is not at peace with the cartel world. He hates it. But he is at peace with his reasons for being in it. Jimmy, on the other hand, does not have a reason. He has Kim. He has a person he loves and does not want to worry. And in that moment, that small, personal, human motivation is both the most sympathetic thing about him and the saddest. Because it is not enough. It was never going to be enough. The episode cuts back regularly to Kim in Albuquerque, unable to reach Jimmy, going to extreme lengths to find out where he is. She poses as Lalo's lawyer, which she technically is not, to visit him in jail and ask for Jimmy's location so she can go look for him. Lalo refuses, but tells her Jimmy will be fine because he is a survivor. The parallel between Kim's frantic, quiet desperation and Jimmy's situation in the desert is not coincidental. Both storylines are about the same thing: the cost of a choice Jimmy made that affected people who had no part in making it. When Jimmy finally runs out of strength and collapses in the desert, Mike spots the surviving gunman approaching. He tells Jimmy to stay down and stay hidden. Jimmy, for reasons that are difficult to entirely explain, but feel completely true to the character, does the opposite. He stands up. He walks out into the road. He makes himself a visible target, drawing the gunman toward him, giving Mike a clear shot. It is the bravest thing Jimmy McGill does in the entire show, and it happens in total silence, at the end of an episode in which he has been humiliated and terrified and physically broken. Mike kills the gunman. They resume walking. The episode ends with them on the road together, still far from anywhere, still carrying the money, still in danger. No resolution, no rescue, just two men walking. The critical consensus on Rotten Tomatoes for Bagman reads that Jimmy undergoes a trial by gunfire in an unpredictable episode given blockbuster suspense by Vince Gilligan's direction. Several critics specifically compared it to the Breaking Bad episode 4 Days Out, a Season 2 episode where Walt and Jesse get stranded in the desert with a broken RV and almost die. 4 Days Out is considered one of Breaking Bad's finest episodes. Bagman does what 4 Days Out did and goes beyond it. The stakes are higher, the visual ambition is greater, and what the episode reveals about its characters is more complete. There is a comparison that gets made sometimes between Bagman and Ozymandias. Which one is the better episode? That comparison is not quite right because the two episodes are doing different things. Ozymandias is a demolition. It tears down everything the show has built over 5 seasons in a single hour. The experience of watching it is overwhelming and devastating, and feels like watching something collapse. Bagman is more like a crucible. It takes two characters and places them under enormous pressure and watches what they are made of. It does not tear anything down. It reveals. Both approaches represent the highest level of television craft. But Bagman does it in a desert with almost no dialogue. In an episode that could have been boring and wasn't. In an hour that proved definitively that Better Call Saul had found its own version of greatness that did not depend on or imitate its predecessor. For years, Breaking Bad had Ozymandias, and Better Call Saul had the question of whether it could match it. After Bagman aired, the question was answered. And the answer was not that BCS had caught up to Breaking Bad. The answer was that the two shows were operating at the same extraordinary level in completely different registers, and that Better Call Saul had found a peak of its own. The episode that finally ended any serious argument about whether this show belonged in the conversation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But as extraordinary as Bagman is as a standalone achievement, it is ultimately one piece of something larger. Because the question of which show is better does not live only in the peaks. It lives in how each show ends, what it chooses to say in its final moments, what it decides its story was actually about. and whether it has the courage to give its characters what they deserve rather than what the audience wants. And on that question, the two finales tell very different stories about what each show believed in. Section 6. The Better Call Saul finale is more honest than Felina. Walter White got what he wanted. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of Breaking Bad's finale. Not what he deserved, not what was fair, not what the people he destroyed deserved, what Walter White wanted. And in the final hour of one of the greatest television shows ever made, Vince Gilligan gave it to him. Think about what Felina, Breaking Bad's series finale, actually delivers for its main character. Walt has been hiding in a cabin in New Hampshire for months, alone and dying, his cancer progressing, his money mostly gone, his family destroyed, his name synonymous with some of the worst drug-related violence Albuquerque has ever seen. He comes back to town with nothing left, and manages, in a single night, to accomplish everything he set out to accomplish in those final hours. He gets money to his son through a clever workaround involving his former business partners. He gives Skylar information that gets her out of legal trouble. He sees his daughter one last time. He kills Jack Welker and his entire gang of neo-Nazis using a remote-controlled machine gun he built into the trunk of his car. He frees Jesse from captivity. He gets to say a genuine goodbye to the meth lab he loved more than almost anything. And then he dies on his own terms, quickly, from a bullet wound rather than the prolonged suffering of cancer, in the place he felt most alive. That is not a punishment. That is a conclusion that lets a monster die feeling like a hero. Breaking Bad creator Vince Gilligan was unambiguous about this in interviews after the finale aired. He said Walt never redeems himself. Peter Gould, who would go on to run Better Call Saul, said the same thing. That what Walt gets at the end is not redemption, but a tiny bit of insight, and that true redemption was not possible given everything Walt had done. The show understood intellectually that Walt did not deserve what the finale gave him, and then it gave it to him anyway. Because the story demanded a certain kind of ending, and because, on some level, the audience wanted to watch Walt win one last time. That tension between what Walt deserved and what the show gave him is the one genuine flaw in an otherwise extraordinary piece of television. It did not ruin the finale. Felina is still a great hour of television. But it is a finale that, in its final gesture, let its main character off easier than the story earned. Better Call Saul's finale, Saul Gone, was built in direct response to that. Peter Gould has spoken openly about the differences between the two finales. He said that when he thought about Felina, what came to mind was a big, rip-roaring episode, full of action and confrontation and dramatic payoff. He said he knew immediately that the ending of Better Call Saul was going to have a completely different feel. Quieter, more reflective, more focused on what the characters owed the people they had hurt, rather than on what they could still accomplish for themselves. The setup of Saul Gone is this. Jimmy McGill, now fully operating as Gene Takovic in Omaha, has been running small-time cons on lonely, sick people in his neighborhood. He gets caught. He is arrested and brought back to face charges not just for what he did in Nebraska, but for everything he did as Saul Goodman during the years of Breaking Bad. All the clients he helped evade justice, all the crimes he enabled, all the ways he made Walter White's operation possible and protected it from the law. His lawyer negotiates a plea deal. Jimmy will spend 7 years in prison. Given everything he actually did, given the scope of the crimes he was involved in, 7 years is extraordinarily lenient. It is, by any reasonable measure, a good outcome for Jimmy McGill. He worked the system one more time, deployed his charm and his legal knowledge on his own behalf, and got himself a deal that most people in his position would have considered a victory. Then Kim shows up at the courthouse. She is there because she gave a statement to the authorities, voluntarily, with no legal pressure, at great personal cost, about her own role in what happened to Howard Hamlin. Her statement can be used to make Jimmy's situation significantly worse. She came forward because she decided it was the right thing to do, not because anyone made her. And seeing her in that courthouse, knowing what she did and why she did it, changes something in Jimmy. He fires his lawyer. In open court, in front of the judge, in front of the federal prosecutors who spent years building this case, he tears up the 7-year deal and starts telling the truth. Not the manageable truth that gets you a lighter sentence. The whole truth. He confesses to things that were not even part of the charges against him. He confesses to his role in everything. He tells the court about Howard Hamlin, about the ways he enabled Walt's operation, about who Saul Goodman actually was, and what Saul Goodman actually did. He does this knowing exactly what it means, that he will almost certainly spend the rest of his life in prison. And then, in front of everyone, he calls himself James McGill for the first time in years. Not Saul Goodman, not Gene Takovic. James McGill. The name he was born with. The name that was attached to the person he was before he let himself become someone else. He does all of this because of Kim. Not because she asked him to. Not because she threatened him, or pressured him, or gave him an ultimatum. Because watching her do the right thing at enormous personal cost reminded him that there was still a version of himself capable of doing the same. That the James McGill who used to care about doing things properly, who once worked as a public defender, who once put together a legitimate legal case entirely on his own, who once showed up to his brother's dark house with groceries because Chuck was family, was still in there somewhere, underneath everything that had accumulated on top of him. The finale received a perfect 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with an average score of 10 out of 10 from 30 reviews. The critical consensus described it as an emotionally powerful and thematically fitting conclusion to one of television's great dramas. A critic at Variety stated directly that Saul Gone was superior to Felina as a series finale. TV Line ranked it as one of the best series finales in television history. The specific thing that makes Saul Gone more honest than Felina is this. Jimmy does not get what he wants. He gets what he owes. Walt died in the lab feeling at peace. Jimmy will spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the show presents that not as a tragedy, but as the correct outcome. The only outcome that is proportionate to what James McGill actually did and what Saul Goodman actually was. The show does not romanticize this. It does not soften it. It does not give Jimmy a dramatic final victory or a clever last con that changes the terms of his punishment. He confesses. He is sentenced. He goes to prison. And the final image of the show is Kim Wexler watching through a prison window as the wall slides across and Jimmy disappears from view. That image of Kim watching Jimmy go, not with relief or with grief exactly, but with the specific expression of someone who has seen something through to its end, is the most honest final image either show produced. Breaking Bad ended with Walt's hands resting on a piece of equipment he loved, a slight smile on his face, dying on his own terms. Better Call Saul ended with two people separated by a wall, having both paid for what they did, living in the world their choices made. There is a scene in Saul Gone where Jimmy and Walter White share the screen one last time. It is a flashback to the period during Breaking Bad when both men were hiding in the vacuum cleaner store's basement, waiting to be given new identities and new lives in new cities. They talk. Walt is as arrogant as he always was, dismissing Jimmy's legal abilities, convinced of his own superiority. Jimmy asks Walt a question that runs through the entire episode. If you had a time machine, what would you go back and change? Walt cannot answer it honestly. He deflects, he reframes. He cannot look directly at what he would change because doing so would require admitting that he did things wrong. And Walt's entire identity is built around the conviction that he did not do things wrong. He did what he had to do. He made the only choices available to him. A man like Walter White does not wish he had done things differently, because a man like Walter White is always, in his own mind, right. Jimmy cannot answer it honestly either, but for a different reason. He keeps giving shallow answers. He jokes. He deflects in his own way. But the question haunts the episode, because the show is building toward a moment when Jimmy will finally stop deflecting. Not in a flashback, not in a hypothetical about time machines, but in open court, on the record, in front of everyone, at the cost of the rest of his life. The difference between Walt's inability to reckon with himself and Jimmy's eventual willingness to do exactly that is the difference between the two finales. Walt's finale says, "This is the man he was, and he got to die being that man." Jimmy's finale says, "This is the man he was, and he chose at the last possible moment to be someone different." Neither ending is a simple victory, but one of them required more from its main character than the other. One of them cost something real. One of them looked at what its protagonist had done across years of choices and said that a 7-year plea deal was not a fair accounting, and that the person standing in that courtroom knew it, and that knowing it and acting on it was the only version of redemption still available to someone who had made the choices James McGill made. Better Call Saul's finale is more honest because it is harder. It asks more of its character, and it gives the audience less of the comfortable resolution they might have wanted. It trusts the viewer to find the satisfaction in a man finally telling the truth, even when the truth costs him everything, rather than in a man winning one last time before he dies. Peter Gould described the core of both the finale and the show in a single sentence. He said that Jimmy and Kim both confessed, both unloaded their consciences, and were both living more honest lives by the end. That is what he wanted the ending to be about. Not justice in the legal sense, not punishment in the dramatic sense. Just two people finally being honest after years of not being, about who they were and what they did. That is a quieter, smaller, more human thing than Walt's machine gun finale. It is also a truer one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while the finale is the last thing you see, the real question of which show is better is not answered only at the end. It is answered across every episode, in every supporting performance, in every character the show built around its leads. Because Better Call Saul did not just have better main characters and a better finale. It had a better ensemble. A collection of supporting players so fully realized, so completely drawn, that the show's world felt more inhabited and more real than the world of its predecessor. And what it did with the characters it inherited from Breaking Bad is one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of television spin-offs. Section 7. BCS has the better supporting cast, top to bottom. Jonathan Banks was already great in Breaking Bad. That needs to be said clearly before anything else, because what comes next is not an argument that Breaking Bad failed with Mike Ehrmantraut. It did not fail. Jonathan Banks played Mike in Breaking Bad as one of the show's most compelling presences. A quiet, efficient, deeply competent man who cleaned up other people's messes and asked for nothing except to be left alone to do his job. Every scene Mike had in Breaking Bad worked. Banks brought a stillness to the character that made him feel genuinely dangerous in a way that louder, more theatrical characters in the show did not quite match. Mike in Breaking Bad is excellent. Mike in Better Call Saul is a completely different and significantly more realized human being. In Breaking Bad, Mike exists in relation to other people's stories. He works for Gus Fring. He manages problems for Walt and Jesse. He is defined largely by what he does rather than by who he is. The show gives him flashes of personal life. His granddaughter, Kaylee. His protectiveness over the workers in Gus's operation. His particular code about not hurting innocent people. But these are glimpses rather than a full portrait. You know Mike is a person with a history. You do not know what that history is, or what it cost him to become who he became. Better Call Saul tells you, and the telling changes everything. Season 1, Episode 6 of Better Call Saul is called 5-0. It is an episode entirely about Mike Ehrmantraut's past. It reveals that Mike was a police officer in Philadelphia, that his son Matt, also a police officer, was killed by corrupt cops on the force after Matt refused to take bribes, and his refusal made him a threat to the officers who were already dirty. That Mike himself had taken bribes earlier in his career and knew exactly how the corruption worked. That when his son came to him for advice about what to do about the corrupt officers he had discovered, Mike told him to take the bribe and stay safe. Matt did not take the bribe. Matt got killed. And Mike, consumed by guilt over the advice he gave his son, went to Albuquerque to be near his daughter-in-law Stacy and his granddaughter Kaylee, the family Matt left behind, and to make sure they were taken care of. That backstory reframes everything Mike does in both shows. His refusal to hurt innocent people is not just a professional code. It is penance. His dedication to Kaylee is not just affection. It is the continuation of a responsibility to his son that he cannot complete in any other way. Every dollar Mike earns in the criminal world and directs toward Kaylee's future is Mike trying to do for Matt's daughter what he failed to do for Matt himself. The entire emotional weight of Mike Ehrmantraut, which you feel in both shows without being able to fully explain in Breaking Bad, becomes completely legible in Better Call Saul. Jonathan Banks received recognition for his work on Better Call Saul that reflected how much fuller the material was. TV Line's direct comparison of the two shows concluded that Banks was even better as Mike on Better Call Saul than he was on Breaking Bad. That is a significant statement about a performance that was already considered one of Breaking Bad's best. But Mike's expanded story is only the beginning of what Better Call Saul did with its supporting cast. Because the show did not just deepen the characters it inherited. It built entirely new ones, from scratch, with no roadmap from the parent show, and made them so fully realized that they would rank among the finest supporting characters in Breaking Bad if they had appeared there. Start with Michael McKean's Chuck McGill, who has been discussed at length already in this essay. Chuck did not exist in Breaking Bad. He was invented entirely for Better Call Saul, given a complete life, a complete psychology, a complete and devastating arc, and performed by McKean at a level that many critics described as the finest work on television in 2017. McKean won a Satellite Award for Best Supporting Actor for his performance. His death in Season 3 remains one of the most emotionally costly moments in either show. Chuck is a character who could have walked into Breaking Bad and been one of its best antagonists. Better Call Saul created him from nothing. Then there is Patrick Fabian's Howard Hamlin. Howard begins the show as an obstacle, the face of the law firm that keeps Jimmy at arm's length, the man who delivers bad news with a smile and a good suit, and an infuriating air of reasonable professionalism. For the first several seasons, he reads as a soft villain, someone whose opposition to Jimmy is small-minded and political rather than genuinely principled. The audience is not meant to like Howard particularly. And then, Better Call Saul does something with Howard in Season 6 that is genuinely unexpected. It reveals that Howard is a good man. Not a complex, morally compromised, interesting in his darkness good man. Simply a good man, with real warmth and real professional integrity and a genuine desire to help people, who has spent years being blamed by Jimmy for things that were largely Chuck's doing rather than his own. Howard knew Jimmy was being blocked from the firm. Howard did not know the full extent of Chuck's campaign against his brother. He was caught between two people whose conflict he could not fully see and could not fully resolve. By the time Jimmy and Kim launched their scheme against Howard in Season 6, drugging him to make him look like a cocaine addict in front of important colleagues, systematically destroying his professional reputation, the audience understands clearly that Howard does not deserve this. The scheme works. Howard is humiliated. And then he is shot and killed in Kim and Jimmy's apartment by Lalo Salamanca, who was not there for Howard at all. Howard simply had the terrible luck of being present when Lalo arrived. Howard Hamlin's death is not dramatic in the way that deaths in Breaking Bad tend to be dramatic. It is sudden and quiet, and almost incidental in terms of Lalo's intentions. But the show has spent enough time making you understand Howard as a full person. His unhappy marriage, his genuine care for the people who worked for him, the specific sadness of a man who built a successful life that somehow felt hollow. That his death lands with a weight completely out of proportion to his status as a supporting character. His death is the moment Kim cannot recover from. It is the event that ends everything. And it matters as much as it does, because Fabian spent 6 seasons making Howard real. Michael Mando's Nacho Varga is another character who did not exist in Breaking Bad, and who Better Call Saul built into someone whose arc deserves to be discussed alongside the main characters. Nacho is a young man working for the Salamanca cartel, who, from very early in the show, is trying to find a way out. He is caught between Hector Salamanca, who is violent and demanding and does not accept the word no, and Gus Fring, who eventually learns of Nacho's disloyalty to the Salamancas, and uses that knowledge to control him completely. Nacho has one consistent motivation throughout his entire arc: protecting his father, a legitimate businessman who wants nothing to do with the criminal world his son got pulled into. Nacho's death in Season 6 is the show's first major loss of the final season, and one of its most carefully constructed scenes. Captured by the Salamancas and facing a death he cannot avoid, Nacho is given the opportunity to blame Gus for Lalo's supposed death, to say what his captors want him to say, which would protect him for a few more minutes. Instead, he uses his final moments to condemn the Salamancas directly, protecting his father by taking away their motivation to go after him, and then shoots himself before they can do it first. It is an act of complete self-sacrifice made by a character who was never a hero, who made choices that caused real harm, but who loved his father more than he loved his own survival. Michael Mando played that scene with such complete control and such genuine weight that it stands as one of the finest single-scene performances in either show.
And then there is Tony Dalton's Lalo Salamanca, who represents something particular in the context of this argument about supporting casts. Lalo did not appear in Breaking Bad. His name is mentioned once, in the very first episode of Breaking Bad, where we meet Saul Goodman. Jimmy, already fully Saul and already terrified, blurts out a reference to Lalo and Ignacio when Walt and Jesse put a bag over his head and drag him into the desert. For years, Breaking Bad viewers had no idea who Lalo was. The name existed as a mystery, a reference to a past that the show never explained. Better Call Saul created Lalo from that single reference. Tony Dalton brought him to life as one of the most frightening and charismatic villains in either show. A man who laughs easily, cooks food for his cartel workers, tells stories, seems genuinely warm, and is also completely and efficiently willing to kill anyone who becomes inconvenient. The combination of warmth and violence in Lalo is more unsettling than simple menace. Simple menace you can prepare for. Lalo seems friendly right up until he doesn't. His death at the hands of Gus Fring in a brilliantly constructed underground confrontation in Season 6 is one of the show's most suspenseful sequences. And the fact that he was invented entirely from a single throwaway name in a different show is itself a testament to what the Better Call Saul team was capable of building. Taken together, Mike's complete backstory, Chuck's devastating arc, Howard's quiet dignity and terrible end, Nacho's sacrifice, Lalo's original menace, and Kim's full transformation. The supporting cast of Better Call Saul represents a depth and breadth of fully realized secondary characters that Breaking Bad, for all its excellence, did not match. Breaking Bad had Dean Norris's Hank Schrader, who was wonderful. It had Giancarlo Esposito's Gus Fring, who was extraordinary. It had Anna Gunn's Skyler, who was given less than she deserved by the show, and treated far worse by a vocal segment of the audience. Better Call Saul gave its supporting players complete lives, complete arcs, complete humanity. It built a world that felt inhabited all the way to its edges, where even the characters who appeared briefly felt like people with histories and futures, rather than functions in a plot. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A show is not just its lead character. It is the world that character moves through, and the people who populate that world, and the degree to which those people feel real. On that measure, Better Call Saul built something richer and more fully populated than its predecessor managed. And it did so while also doing something that Breaking Bad's drama never quite had room for: a sustained, serious examination of the moral weight of complicity, of what it means not just to do wrong, but to watch someone do wrong and say nothing, or worse, to enjoy it. That question, and what Better Call Saul does with it across 6 seasons, is what ultimately separates the two shows at the deepest level. Section 8. BCS is about moral complicity in a way Breaking Bad wasn't. Walter White made a choice. One choice, really, at the beginning. He decided to cook meth. Everything that followed, every murder, every lie, every destroyed relationship,
every ruined life grew out of that first decision. Breaking Bad is a story about a man who chose to do a bad thing and then kept choosing, over and over, to go further into the bad thing until there was no version of himself left that remembered what it felt like to choose differently. The moral architecture of the show is relatively clean. Walt chooses. Walt acts. Walt is responsible. That clarity is one of Breaking Bad's great strengths. The show never lets Walt off the hook. It never seriously entertains the idea that circumstances forced him here, that he had no options, that any reasonable person in his position would have done the same thing. Walt's transformation is his own. His darkness is his own. He owns it, even when he refuses to admit that he owns it. But that clarity also has a limit, because most people who do genuinely terrible things in the real world do not do them through a single dramatic choice followed by a commitment to going further and further into darkness. Most people who end up somewhere they should not be got there gradually, through small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, through things they told themselves were temporary or necessary or not really their fault, through the slow accumulation of moments where they knew something was wrong and said nothing and did nothing and let it continue. That process, the quiet, ordinary, almost invisible process of becoming complicit in something you know is wrong, is what Better Call Saul is about. And it is a harder and more honest subject than Breaking Bad's clean story of a man choosing his own darkness. The word complicit means being involved in something bad even if you did not do the bad thing yourself. It means knowing something is wrong and allowing it to happen. It means being close enough to damage to share some of its weight even if your hands are technically clean. Better Call Saul is the most serious examination of complicity in the history of American television drama, and it conducts that examination through almost every character in its world simultaneously. Kim Wexler is the clearest example and the most devastating one. Kim does not cook meth. Kim does not kill anyone. Kim does not steal money or threaten witnesses or help a drug lord evade justice. What Kim does is smaller, and in some ways harder to defend precisely because it is smaller. She watches Jimmy cut corners and says nothing. She participates in small cons that feel victimless, and mostly are. She allows herself to enjoy the thrill of bending rules that she knows perfectly well are there for good reasons. She tells herself that the targets of their schemes deserve what they get. She tells herself that the legal system she is supposed to trust is imperfect enough that working around it occasionally is not really wrong. None of these are dramatic villain decisions. They are the kinds of rationalizations that ordinary, intelligent, genuinely well-intentioned people make every day. The show presents them without exaggeration, without theatrical lighting or dramatic music to tell you that something important is happening. Kim's slide into complicity looks, from the outside, like nothing much at all. That is exactly the point. Howard Hamlin does not deserve what happens to him. He is not a good target for the scheme Kim and Jimmy design. He did not do the things Jimmy blamed him for in the early seasons. Jimmy blamed Howard for Chuck's actions because Chuck was the person Jimmy could not bring himself to fully condemn, and Howard was a convenient substitute. By the time Kim has access to the truth about what Chuck did and what Howard's actual role was, she is already too invested in disliking Howard to revise her assessment. She has built a justification for the scheme, and she does not want the justification dismantled. That specific failure, knowing something is not quite right and choosing not to look at it too clearly, is what complicity looks like at its most ordinary. Kim is not a monster. She is someone who let herself stop looking too carefully at a thing she was doing, because looking carefully would have required her to stop. Better Call Saul treats that failure with complete seriousness, and without any suggestion that it is excusable. Howard dies as a direct consequence of the situation Kim and Jimmy created. Not because they intended it, not because they knew Lalo Salamanca would walk through their door that night, but because their scheme put Howard in that apartment at that time, and Lalo did not leave witnesses. The chain of cause and effect is clear. Kim and Jimmy are not Lalo. They did not pull the trigger. And they are also not innocent. The show holds both of those things simultaneously without resolving the tension between them. This is the moral territory that Breaking Bad did not have the structural space to explore. Breaking Bad needed Walt to be responsible because the show was built around one man's deliberate choices. Responsibility required agency. Walt had to be choosing his darkness, not drifting into it. Because a story about drifting does not produce the same clear moral satisfaction as a story about choosing. Better Call Saul is structured around characters who drift. Jimmy drifts. Kim drifts. Nacho Varga drifts into a criminal world that he is too young and too broke to see an exit from until it is far too late. Mike Ehrmantraut made one genuinely bad choice, taking a bribe as a police officer in Philadelphia, and has spent the rest of his life managing the consequences of that single moment of weakness. Each consequence requiring another compromise, each compromise pulling him further from the person he thought he was. Mike in Better Call Saul does not feel like someone who chose to be a criminal. He feels like someone who made one mistake and found the exit blocked at every turn. That drift, the experience of looking up one day and realizing you are somewhere you did not intend to be, is something that most people recognize from their own lives in a way that Walt's dramatic descent does not quite reach. Nobody becomes Walt. People become people who knew something was wrong and said nothing. People become people who enjoyed a thing they knew they should not enjoy and let themselves have it anyway. People become people who built a justification for something and chose not to examine the justification too carefully. Better Call Saul is the show about those people. And it is, as a result, the show that has more to say about how ordinary human beings actually fail morally, not through dramatic villainy, but through the quiet daily choice to look away. There is a moment in Season 6 where Kim tells Jimmy the truth about why she went along with the scheme against Howard for as long as she did. She tells him that she was having too much fun. Not that she was manipulated, not that she felt she had no choice, that she found the whole thing genuinely exciting, and that her excitement was the real problem. And that she is someone who has a dark thing in her that she spent years trying not to have, and eventually stopped fighting against. That admission is the most honest thing any character says in either show. It is honest in a way that Walt's confession to Skyler in Breaking Bad's finale, that he did it for himself because it made him feel alive, is not quite. Because Walt's confession came at the very end, with nothing left to lose. Kim's admission came while she still had a life to protect, a career to salvage, a relationship to preserve. She said it anyway, and then she lived with what it meant. Breaking Bad asked you to watch a man choose his darkness and follow him into it. Better Call Saul asked you to watch ordinary people find darkness they did not know they had, let themselves have it in small increments, and then reckon with what those small increments added up to. The second question is harder to face. It is closer to home, and it produces across 6 seasons of patient, careful storytelling, a moral portrait that is more complete and more honest than anything Breaking Bad attempted. The show about choosing to be bad is a great show. The show about accidentally becoming someone who did bad things without ever making one single obvious villain's choice is, in the end, the greater achievement. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And none of that moral weight, none of the complicity, none of the drift, none of the quiet accumulation of wrong choices could land as hard as it does without the structural device that Better Call Saul built its entire existence around. A device so unusual, so carefully executed, and so formally ambitious that no other drama in television history had attempted it at this scale. 3 separate timelines, running simultaneously, each one reframing the others in ways that take the full 6 seasons to completely understand. Section 9. The Gene Takovic black and white sequences, a narrative device Breaking Bad never had. Every season of Better Call Saul begins in black and white. No color, no warmth, no Albuquerque sun turning the desert gold at the edges. Just gray walls, gray light, gray everything, and a middle-aged man in a red Cinnabon uniform moving through the routines of a life that does not belong to him. He makes cinnamon rolls. He counts his register. He walks to his car in an empty parking lot and drives home alone to a house where he keeps the curtains closed. He does not talk to his neighbors. He does not make friends. He watches old videotapes of his own television commercials late at night in the dark, the only evidence remaining that he was once someone who mattered in his own story. His name, in this gray world, is Gene Takovic. But that is not his real name. His real name is James McGill, and before that name, he went by Saul Goodman for years. A criminal lawyer who helped one of the most dangerous drug operations in the history of New Mexico avoid the law, who made himself indispensable to a meth kingpin, who told himself the whole time that he was just a businessman providing a service, and that what happened to the people on the other end of that service was not his problem. Gene Takovic is what is left after all of that. A man hiding in Nebraska. A man who lost everything and ran, and is now so frightened of being recognized that he has compressed himself into the smallest possible version of a human being. He makes sandwiches for strangers and goes home and closes the curtains. That is the image Better Call Saul opens with at the beginning of every single season. Before the color comes back, before the story of Jimmy McGill in Albuquerque begins again, the show shows you this. It shows you where the road ends. And then it takes you back to the beginning of the road, in full color, and asks you to watch the journey knowing exactly where it goes. No other drama in television history had attempted this structure at this scale. Breaking Bad had flash forwards. The show used them cleverly, particularly the cold opens at the start of certain episodes that dropped you into a future moment before pulling you back to the present timeline. The machine gun in the trunk of Walt's car, shown in a flash forward at the start of Season 5, created months of audience speculation about what it would be used for and when. Those flash forwards were effective tools for building tension and creating mystery. They worked well within Breaking Bad's framework, but they were used sparingly and specifically as individual devices within individual episodes. They were not a structural framework that organized the entire show. They did not create a separate timeline running parallel to the main story across 5 full seasons. They were glimpses rather than a world. The Gene timeline in Better Call Saul is a world. It has its own setting, its own supporting characters, its own problems, its own emotional register. And across 6 seasons, it develops from a brief, melancholy prologue into a full storyline that ultimately converges with the main narrative and provides the show's true ending. In the early seasons, the Gene sequences are short, a few minutes at the beginning of the first episode of each season. Gene at the Cinnabon, Gene watching his old commercials, Gene catching a glimpse of someone who might recognize him and freezing with fear. These sequences establish the destination. This sad, frightened, diminished man is who Jimmy McGill eventually becomes. And then step back and let the color story of Albuquerque take over. But as the seasons progress, the Gene sequences grow. They develop their own plot. In season 4, Gene has a health scare and ends up in the hospital. And the terror on his face as he tries to give a fake name to the medical staff without revealing who he actually is tells you everything about the specific texture of life as a person in hiding. In season 5, a taxi driver recognizes him, and Gene has to decide what to do about it. Whether to run again, to start over somewhere new, to keep his head down and hope, or to do something else entirely. What Gene chooses to do in season 6 is the most revealing thing the show does with his character. Rather than running, rather than accepting the diminished gray life he has been living, Gene starts running small cons on lonely and vulnerable people in Omaha. He targets men who are sick, men who are isolated, men who have money and no family nearby to protect them. He befriends them, earns their trust, figures out where they keep their valuables and their financial information, and then has an associate rob them while Gene keeps them distracted. This is Slippin' Jimmy, the con artist that Jimmy McGill was before he was ever a lawyer. Back again, in black and white, in Nebraska, years after everything that was supposed to have changed him. And that is the point. The Gene timeline does not exist to show you that Jimmy found peace, or that running away gave him a fresh start, or that consequence eventually arrived from outside and forced him to reckon with his choices. It exists to show you that without something or someone to be better for, Jimmy McGill defaults to who he always was underneath everything else. The law career could not change him permanently because he did it partly for Chuck's approval. And Chuck is gone. The Saul Goodman persona gave him a costume, but not a conscience. Even the horror of watching Howard Hamlin die in his apartment, even the loss of Kim, even years of hiding in a gray Nebraskan life, none of it fundamentally altered the wiring. Only Kim could do that. And Kim is gone. So Gene cons sick people in Omaha until one of his targets starts dying during one of the schemes, and Gene, sitting in the dying man's house, makes a phone call. He calls 911. He stays on the line. He makes sure the ambulance is coming. He does this at enormous personal risk to himself, because calling emergency services from a location he is supposed to be secretly robbing is the kind of thing that gets people caught. He stays anyway. That phone call is the crack in Gene's armor, the first indication that something in him is not entirely gone. And it is what eventually puts him on the path toward the courthouse and the confession and the end of the show. The black and white visual choice is not simply stylistic. It is doing specific, meaningful work every time it appears. Color in Better Call Saul represents the world of possibility. The Albuquerque years where Jimmy is still becoming, still choosing, still moving through a story whose ending is not yet written, even though the audience knows it. The gray of the Gene sequences represents the world after possibility has closed. The aftermath, the consequence. The life you are left with when all the choices have been made, and most of them were wrong. Every time the show moves from color to black and white, or from black and white to color, it is making a statement about time and consequence, and the relationship between who a person is in their most alive moments and who they become when the aliveness has been used up. The transition is never jarring because the show earns it. By the time you are deep into a season and the Gene prologue is a recent memory, the color of Albuquerque feels slightly haunted. You are watching something bright, knowing that it is on its way to gray. Better Call Saul also uses the Gene timeline to do something specifically clever with the audience's relationship to the Breaking Bad events. Because Gene exists after Breaking Bad, certain things that happen in the main show's timeline are visible to him in ways that produce a kind of double awareness in the viewer. When Jimmy, in the color timeline, makes a choice that you know will contribute to the gray world of the Gene sequences, the weight of that choice is doubled. You feel it in real time, and you feel its future consequence simultaneously. The show runs both emotional experiences at once, and the result is a depth of feeling that a single timeline story cannot produce. The three-timeline structure, the Gene sequences set after Breaking Bad, the main Jimmy McGill story set before Breaking Bad, and the sequences set during Breaking Bad that appear in the final season, required the writing team to maintain absolute clarity about where every scene existed in time, and what each timeline knew that the others did not. Peter Gould has described the structural challenge of running these timelines as one of the most demanding aspects of making the show. Getting it wrong would have collapsed the entire framework. Getting it right, which Better Call Saul did across 6 seasons without a single moment of genuine confusion for the audience, produced something that rewards the kind of attention most television does not ask for and cannot reward. Breaking Bad was a great show built on a single timeline moving forward. Better Call Saul was a great show built on 3 timelines running simultaneously, each one reframing the others, creating a viewing experience that changes meaning as it goes.
One of those structural approaches had never been attempted before. One of them produced something that could only be seen whole once the final episode ended and all 3 timelines had converged into a single image. A prison wall sliding across a window, and a woman watching, and a man on the other side who had finally told the truth. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And for all that Better Call Saul built, the characters, the visual craft, the structural innovation, the moral depth, the one thing that might tell you most clearly which show is better is not any of those achievements. It is a number. A specific, maddening, almost unbelievable number that says more about what the television industry thought of Better Call Saul than any review or rating or critical essay ever could. Section 10. BCS. Received 53 Emmy nominations and 0 wins. And that injustice is itself a measure of its greatness. 53 times. 53 times the people responsible for choosing the best television in America looked at Better Call Saul and said this is one of the finest things on television right now. 53 times across 6 seasons, the Emmy Awards nominated the show for its writing, its directing, its acting, its cinematography, its sound, its editing. 53 nominations spread across every category that matters, in every year the show was eligible, building into one of the longest and most consistent records of recognition in the history of the awards. And then, 53 times, they gave the award to something else. Not once, not a single win from 53 nominations. Better Call Saul holds a record in Emmy history that no other show has matched. The most nominations without a single victory. It is a record that the people who made the show did not want, that the people who watched the show did not understand, and that the people who study television have called one of the most embarrassing oversights the awards have ever produced. Breaking Bad, by comparison, received 58 nominations across its run and won 16 Emmy Awards. It won Outstanding Drama Series twice.
Bryan Cranston won Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series 4 times for playing Walter White. Aaron Paul won Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Drama Series 3 times for playing Jesse Pinkman. Anna Gunn won Outstanding Supporting Actress twice. The show won Writing Awards and Directing Awards and was celebrated by the Emmy voters as exactly the kind of television it turned out to be. Exceptional, groundbreaking, worthy of the highest recognition the industry could offer. Better Call Saul was all of those things too, and it got nothing. The 0 is not a reflection of quality. The people who made the Emmy nominations understood that perfectly clearly. You do not nominate a show 53 times across 6 years if you think it is anything less than extraordinary. The nominations tell you what the industry actually believed about Better Call Saul. The losses tell you something different and less flattering. About the specific way award systems work, about the shows that were competing in the same years, and about the particular difficulty of recognizing a quiet, patient, slow-burning drama in an era of television that rewarded loudness and spectacle. The acting nominations alone represent some of the most consistent recognition of performance quality in the history of the awards. Bob Odenkirk was nominated for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series 5 times for playing Jimmy McGill across the show's run. 5 consecutive years of the Emmy voters watching his performance and saying, "This is one of the best things happening on television right now." 5 consecutive years of giving the award to someone else. Ray Seahorn's situation was even more discussed and more openly criticized. She was nominated for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Drama Series twice, in the final seasons of the show, after years of critics and audiences calling her exclusion from the nominations one of the most glaring oversights in the awards' history. Her performance as Kim Wexler was described by Brian Tallarico of Rolling Stone as one of the best performances on any show in the last decade. CNN's Brian Lowry said after Season 5 that the show had essentially become Seahorn's year, that no one on television was doing more impressive work. Several critics described her exclusion from even the nominations in those early seasons as evidence that the Emmy voters were simply not watching closely enough. When she was finally nominated, she lost both times. To Jennifer Coolidge in The White Lotus in 2023, and to Julia Garner in Ozark in 2022. Both of those performances were good. Neither of them, in the assessment of most serious critics who covered both shows, represented work of the same depth and consistency that Seahorn had been delivering for 6 years. TV Line published a piece after the show ended, calling Better Call Saul's Emmy record a travesty. The word travesty means something that is so unfair or so wrong that it is almost embarrassing. That is the word a major television publication chose for what happened to Better Call Saul at the Emmy Awards, and it is hard to argue with the choice. Jonathan Banks was nominated for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Drama Series for his work as Mike Ehrmantraut. Michael McKean was nominated for Outstanding Guest Actor in a Drama Series for his work as Chuck McGill in Season 4, after Chuck had already died in Season 3. A posthumous recognition of a performance that critics in 2017 had called the finest supporting work on television that year. Neither won. The show's writing team received multiple nominations. Gordon Smith, one of the show's writers, was nominated 3 times for Outstanding Writing for a Drama Series, including for the episode 5-0, the Mike Ehrmantraut origin episode in Season 1 that redefined the character and set the emotional tone for everything Mike would do across the rest of the show. 3 nominations, 0 wins. The directing nominations told the same story. Vince Gilligan himself directed the episode Bagman in Season 5. 18 days of filming in the desert, one of the most ambitious single episodes of television production in recent memory, universally praised by critics, and received recognition for it in the form of a nomination that went nowhere. Better Call Saul was nominated for Outstanding Drama Series in every single year it was eligible. 6 seasons, 6 nominations for the highest award a drama series can receive in American television. The shows it lost to included Game of Thrones, Succession, The Crown, and The Handmaid's Tale. All excellent shows, all worthy of recognition. None of which, in the consensus view of serious television critics, were operating at a higher level than Better Call Saul across those years. The pattern that emerges from the full record is clear. Better Call Saul was a show that the Emmy voters consistently recognized as extraordinary and consistently failed to reward. The recognition is in the nominations. The failure is in the zeros next to each one. There is a specific reason this matters beyond the simple injustice of a great show being undervalued by an awards system. The Emmy record is, paradoxically, one of the strongest arguments for Better Call Saul being the better show. Not because losing awards makes you better, but because the specific way the show was overlooked tells you something important about what kind of show it was and why it was difficult to reward. Emmy voters, like most audiences, respond strongly to certain kinds of television. They respond to big moments, shocking deaths, dramatic confrontations, explosive finale sequences. They respond to shows that give their actors clear, defined, high-intensity scenes that demonstrate obvious skill in obvious ways. They respond to spectacle and to the feeling that what they are watching is important while they are watching it. Better Call Saul almost never gave them any of those things. Its finest moments were quiet. Its best performances were built on restraint, on what the actors chose not to do, on the pauses and the silences, and the expressions held for a beat longer than expected. Its most devastating scenes did not announce themselves with dramatic music or raised voices. They arrived quietly and then sat there, accumulating weight, in the specific way that the show had trained its audience to receive them. That kind of excellence is genuinely harder to vote for than the kind Breaking Bad offered. Bryan Cranston's Walter White gave voters scenes of enormous theatrical intensity, screaming, physical confrontation, moral declaration, the full external expression of internal collapse. Those scenes are easy to recognize as great acting because they announce themselves as great acting. Odenkirk's Jimmy McGill and Seahorn's Kim Wexler and Banks's Mike Ehrmantraut did their finest work in scenes that did not announce themselves at all. Scenes that required you to have watched everything that came before to understand what was happening in the space between the words. The Wire, widely considered one of the greatest television dramas ever made, was nominated for the Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series exactly once across its entire 5-season run, and never won. Its creator, David Simon, has spoken openly about the awards system's failure to recognize the show during its run. The Wire's legacy was built not on Emmy wins, but on the sustained, serious attention of critics, academics, and viewers who understood what it was doing and kept talking about it. Better Call Saul's legacy is being built the same way. Its Rotten Tomatoes critics score of 98% edges Breaking Bad's 96%. Critics who covered both shows consistently placed Better Call Saul alongside or above its predecessor in their final assessments. The show's finale received a perfect score from 30 consecutive reviews. The absence of Emmy wins did not change any of those facts. It just made the facts more interesting. A show that gets nominated 53 times and wins nothing is not a show that the industry failed to notice. It is a show that the industry noticed completely, recognized fully, and then found too difficult, or too quiet, or too patient to actually reward in the moment. That is a specific kind of failure on the part of the voters, and a specific kind of testament to what Better Call Saul was. The greatest trick Better Call Saul ever pulled was making a show so good that even the people who refused to give it awards could not stop nominating it. 53 times they looked at it and said, "This is among the best." 53 times they gave the trophy to something louder. The trophy is not the argument. The 53 nominations are. And taken together with everything this essay has covered, the structure, the characters, the cinematography, the moral depth, the finale, the ensemble, the innovation, they complete a picture of a show that did something rarer and harder than Breaking Bad. Not a louder thing, not a more dramatic thing, a truer thing, a more patient thing. A thing built to last longer than the conversation that was happening around it at the time. Better Call Saul was always going to outlive its Emmy record. It already has. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.